If you flip through TV stations on Sunday morning or the radio, you will be bombarded with requests and sometimes demands to give the preacher money, often with a promise that you will be blessed because of it. Several famous preachers recently have gone so far as to seek tens of millions of dollars in donations for private jets. These people are con artists. But even on a local level, even with people that we trust, it's a running joke that it isn't a church service unless someone passes a plate around or asks for money. All across America, sermons are preached every week on the importance of tithing. And church-going Christians in America, on average, give just over $800 a year to charity, mostly their church. Giving money to the church is just a regular part of the fabric of what being Christian in America means. It's always there. And whether it gets met or not, the expectation in almost every church in America is that each parishioner will give 10% or more of their earnings back to the church. But when asked what that money is for, most parishioners respond that it is used to help people or that they don't know. How modern American evangelical churches actually spend their money, however, is fairly straightforward and surprisingly consistent across denominations and church sizes. The biggest expense by far is the staff, the pastor. Between about 40 and 50% of the church's budget goes to pay for staff. The next 30 to 40% goes to pay for a building, which includes the mortgage, the utilities, the maintenance, etc., etc. But keep in mind that this is the operating budget. This does not include special money raised for a church building, which 40% of churches are in some stage of raising money for their building outside of the normal budget. So this number in actuality of total money raised is probably much higher, but there just aren't many good statistics on it. We are so building obsessed, in fact, that of those churches planning on launching a building campaign in the next year, 18% were still collecting from a previous campaign, and 11% are still in one as they plan for the next campaign. Buildings take up the vast majority of fundraising efforts, which means they take up an enormous amount of the total cash raised by a church. Which is funny because if you look at most individual church budgets, they separate out all of the different expenses of the building to make it look like it's as small as possible. Of the remaining expenditures, ministries within the church get 5 to 10%, with children and youth getting the lion's share of that. International missions generally get about 5% of the total budget. Denominations also take a cut, often 10, sometimes up to 20%, but I'm not including that here because many churches are not part of a denomination. The rest of the average budget is mainly office supplies, with only between 1 and 5% of the budget given over to local missions outside the church. 1%. In one survey of 1,100 churches, evangelism and outreach were mentioned as expenses at all only 3 times out of all of the respondents. And compassionate ministry, or giving to those in need, didn't even make the list as a separate item. Yet those are the things that many Christians think most of the church's money goes towards. And this whole chart is assuming that the church in question doesn't have any debt, which unfortunately is not the case. Of the 200 largest Methodist churches in the U.S., for example, over half of them had debt, which on average measured almost $3 million apiece. And of those with debt, a quarter of them had debt that was more than twice their annual income, the repayment of which can cripple a church for decades. But hey, gotta have that big building with the fancy lights, am I right? Now, almost all of this money comes from individual donations, particularly tithing, around 87% of the operating budget, in fact. The rest comes mostly from other fundraising like youth car washes and rental properties, or the money that a church takes in to cover the cost of a youth event, for instance. But the vast majority of the money of the church comes from tithes, and the vast majority of that cash is spent on the pastors in the building. How did we ever get in this situation? Because aside from a few verses in the Old Testament, particularly pertaining to Levites and the temple, the Bible doesn't say much about tithing. Giving to those in need and doing so freely is critical, but Jesus didn't pass a plate around or seek donations. And while the early church shared their money with each other, a 10% tithe appears to be completely missing from their lives. Only one Christian writer of the first 250 years of Christianity mentions a 10% tithe, and it did not seem to have been well received. Tithing was not really a thing. That seems shocking to us today, but they pulled this off because for the first several hundred years of Christianity, professional clergy and church buildings are almost completely absent as well. While some Christian leaders certainly appear to have been taken care of by their congregations fairly early on, these were traveling leaders over several congregations. And the idea that every house church needed a paid pastor would have been completely foreign to the early church, let alone the idea that they should raise a set amount of money each week for that person. But this changed with the Emperor Constantine and his heirs. With Christianity normalized and then endorsed by the state, there weren't enough houses to meet the need for places of worship. Instead, the emperors began to build massive basilicas, modeled upon pagan temples, to house the new converts. Now, these building projects were often done with public money, but the local churches needed to maintain them. And new converts were not giving voluntarily. So a more formal tithe began to take shape to support these massive buildings. Right alongside new buildings also came new clergy. Instead of the priesthood of all believers working together, there was an obvious need of full-time workers to teach these new converts about Christianity. These new priests wore special robes like pagan priests, carried lights and incense in their ceremonies like pagan priests, and had special music like pagan ceremonies. And they needed to be paid like pagan priests. As time went on, the church began to collect land bequeathed to them by wealthy patrons, and the tithe took root as a 10% tax on the people renting from the church, loosely supported on biblical grounds by linking the priesthood with the Levites of the Old Testament. But in reality, the church was just being a landowner and taxing their renters at a rate that was standard for Europe at the time. By the 8th century, nation-states began instituting an official church tax as a tithe on everybody. Most nations have done away with that, but some still have church taxes, usually around 1.5% of a person's income, particularly for the believers in that country to support the church. Which adds yet another wrinkle to what I talked about last week of how the church has actively either been the state or sought support from the state throughout history because they needed a regular source of income to support the professional priesthood and the massive churches that so quickly had become normal. Individual 10% tithing is only necessary when no other options are available and has at best been intermittently reinforced over the centuries. For instance, even today, the Church of England has barely any tithing, with only $76 tithed per attendee every year. Instead, the majority of their income comes from an $8.3 billion investment and endowment pool. So why is tithing such a big deal in the United States? Well, several reasons. First, while American churches do rely heavily upon church and clergy tax breaks, they do not receive money from the government, leaving churches to have to find other means of support. Coupled with the relative youth of American churches compared to European churches, there hasn't been enough time for most American churches to build investments or accumulate land over the centuries. Without an investment pool to draw from, American churches have been forced to raise money each week from within the congregation. Now, churches can usually survive on about 1% to 2% of a congregation's income, but because only a small percentage of the people actually tithe, it requires a rate of 10% from those who give in order to keep the wheels moving. But two particular aspects of American culture also play into why churches here need money so often and spend it so poorly. First, America's obsession with big things has led churches to try and emulate that, building bigger and bigger buildings, which require more and more resources to maintain. Instead of a series of smaller, paid-for buildings, we have mega churches with mega obligations. Too many churches have buildings far larger than they need and are willing to pour far too much money into sustaining them because of the perceived status of having a big, impressive building. Second, the modern movement towards specialization and professionalism has hit the church. We no longer want to see a normal general doctor when we have a problem. We want a specialist to look after that particular issue. We don't make our own clothes anymore or fix our own cars. We have professionals do that. In the same way, churches have taken what used to be the job of average congregants, like doing the books, cleaning the church, guiding a youth group, leading worship service, or writing curriculum for children's programs, and have made them the sole job of the professional pastor. Jobs like worship pastor, administrative pastor, youth pastor, children's pastor, none of those were a thing even a century and a half ago. And with each volunteer position that gets turned over to a specialist, the ability of the congregation to do that job themselves atrophies. And something that they once could do without thinking becomes impossibly out of reach for them without special training. Because skills like writing curriculum or doing the church books or how to handle a youth group just don't get passed on if there's a professional to do it for you. So we end up with churches who possess buildings far too large for their need, often saddled with debt, and filled with staff doing jobs that volunteers once did quite well, all while demanding more and more tithe from fewer and fewer people to maintain it all. But still managing somehow to find that 1% of the church's cash to do what Jesus actually told us to do. Feed the poor, clothe the naked, give water to the thirsty, tell the nations of Jesus' love. I am a pastor who preaches in a church building far too large for my people. I am part of the problem. We have lost the mark. In the words of John 11:35, Jesus wept. Good night.